Okay, so this week we're going to talk about islands. So last week we spent some time talking about the relationship between our knowledge of language, called competence, and our ability to process and produce language, which we can describe as performance. And we talked a bit about the relationship between linguistics and psycholinguistics. Prior to that, we were spending a lot of time and putting a lot of attention into thinking about child language acquisition and thinking a bit about how children learn languages. Is something innate? And if so, what's innate? And what does that have to do with how we describe languages, right? And so today we're going to talk about islands. Islands, some of you might be familiar with the phenomena of islands, and some of you might not be familiar with island phenomena. Um, but they're an interesting test case for both kinds of questions that we've explored so far. Islands, we will see, are very interesting to think about from the perspective of child language acquisition. Islands are the kind of phenomena that are often used to argue for a rich, structured universal grammar, right? The claim is that learning these island phenomena is unlikely to be successful just by observing data. It's a poverty of the stimulus argument. Therefore, whatever the final explanation of islands is, has to fall out from the child's innate endowment. We're going to see that there's some interesting data from child language acquisition suggesting that kids do know islands pretty young. We'll see the interpretation of that results is maybe somewhat controversial, but there's some interesting facts to the matter here. There's some interesting data on the table suggesting that island phenomena are the kind of thing that is relevant for how children learn language, or it's something that children seem to know, right? That's some kind of knowledge that children show some knowledge of. And we're also going to see that islands are interesting from the perspective of how language processing works. We're going to see that there's a nice connection between what syntacticians will tell us is a grammatical or an ungrammatical sentence of English or whatever language we're studying, and the kind of structures that people consider when they're processing sentences. It's also interesting to think about islands for another reason, right? And that is, islands are the kind of thing that might be explained by appealing to how processing works. So, a theory that we might consider is that island phenomena are actually not about the grammar at all. Instead, they fall out of how the parsing system works. And so we're going to build up to those questions. The goal for this week is just to really talk about the phenomenon. Some of you have had some more advanced syntax classes, some of you haven't. The prereq for this class is just syntax 1, so you probably may not have actually even seen or heard of islands until today, if you've only taken syntax 1. And that's fine. We're going to kind of talk about it at a medium level of granularity or generalizations. We're not going to have any trees today, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page of understanding what are we trying to explain and what are the criteria for deciding whether we have a good theory of islands, right? So if you've already taken advanced syntax, you might feel tempted to tune out. Please don't. Please try to stick with this, because I think I'm still going to highlight some facts that maybe you aren't familiar with, and I will try to raise questions as appropriate about what we might want to think about with respect to child language acquisition and language processing. Okay, so let's start with some really basic observations. Like, before we even start talking about islands, let's remind ourselves about filler gap dependencies. So as we talked about last week, filler gap dependencies are how psycholinguists refer to what Chomskyan generative syntacticians call movement, right? But put kind of theoretically neutrally, let's say, when you hear a sentence like, which mouse did Ollie attack? In that sentence, attack is a verb and mouse is its object, but mouse does not appear in the typical place you would expect to see the object. Usually, the object of the verb attack comes afterwards, but in this particular sentence, mouse comes at the beginning of the sentence, and we need to somehow understand that the mouse is the thing that's being attacked. A little bit more theoretically put, we can say that the expression which mouse has two functions in this sentence. It's first of all the object of the verb attack, and it also is marking the WH scope of the sentence, right? So in other words, this sentence is a question, right? And we know it's a question because which mouse occurs at the beginning of the sentence. And what's interesting is that these filler gap dependencies, and you'll recall from the Phillips and Wagers papers, we use this term because there's a gap, a part of the sentence where something is missing that's associated with the filler, right? The phrase that has the relevant function that's missing. And we can see that these filler gap dependencies can cross arbitrary distances. So, again, this is a statement at the competence level, right? Obviously, it's not possible to produce a sentence that goes on for a billion words, right? So there's some upper limit in terms of our actual capacity to produce or to understand sentences. But in principle, we don't actually see an upper bound. So you can say things like, which mouse did Sniffle see Ollie attack? You can say, which mouse did you say that Sniffle saw Ollie attack? Which mouse did it seem that John thought that Mary said that Sniffle saw Ollie attack, etc., 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 right? So we can see that these sentences can kind of continuously grow in length, and yet mouse is still understood as the object of the verb attack. So if you've learned generative syntax, which is the kind of syntax we teach here, you've probably learned this as a movement dependency, right? We can think that at D structure or at earlier stages of the derivation, that expression which mouse starts at the object of the verb attack and then moves up. There are other ways to think about this and other kinds of theories of grammar, but they all basically share the intuition that we're trying to explain that mouse is the object of the verb attack and also serve some function higher up in the sentence, right? As I said, it kind of marks the WH-ness of the whole sentence. But what's interesting is that even though filler gap dependencies appear to cross arbitrary distances, there are some structures that they cannot cross. So whereas which mouse did you say that Sniffle saw Ollie attack sounds okay, which mouse did you say whether Sniffle saw Ollie attack sounds kind of funny, right? There's something funny about swapping in the word that for the word whether that makes a sentence sound worse. And so this is what we refer to as an island. Put briefly, an island is basically some construction that a filler gap dependency can't cross without sounding funny, let's say. Alternatively, if we want to state this in terms of kind of a theoretical syntax way, right, we can say an island is some constituent or some structure that you can't move out of without incurring some penalty, let's say. So what are the islands? Well, there's kind of a whole list of these, and different phenomena show slightly different kinds of properties. You can spend a lot of time talking about this. Like, there's many different kinds of islands. I'm going to give you some of the usual suspects that we see occurring in many, many different languages. So one we already saw, which are sometimes called weather islands. So if you have a clause that has a whether or an if in it, it usually sounds kind of funny to move out of that. So which mouse did you say whether Ollie attacked? Sounds a little funny. Other WH clauses also sound bad. So if you have a WH at the beginning of a clause, it sounds funny to move another thing over it. So if you say something like, which mouse did you say who attacked? That sounds kind of funny, right? So you're saying something like, you said who attacked some mouse, and now I want to know who that mouse is. So which mouse did you say who attacked? That sounds kind of funny in English. Relative clauses are also bad to move out of. Which mouse did you pet the cat that attacked? Right? So the cat attacked some mouse. Which mouse did you pet the cat that attacked? Right? That sounds kind of funny. Conjunctions, we'll mention something more interesting about conjunctions in a minute here, but if you're conjoining phrases, it sounds funny to move out of one of those conjoined phrases. So if Ollie chased the ball and then attacked one of his toy mice, by the way, Ollie is my cat and Sniffle is his twin, my other cat, right? It sounds kind of funny to say something like, which mouse did Ollie chase the ball and attack, right? So it sounds kind of funny to coordinate two verb phrases in this case and then move out of one of those verb phrases. Subject noun phrases are also funny to move out of. Which mouse did the cat next to chase the ball? I have an error here. That verb should be bear, not chased. So the cat next to the blue mouse chased the ball. Which mouse did the cat next to chase the ball? Sounds kind of funny. Clausal adjuncts. So not all adjuncts, but if you have if you have an adjunct that has a VP in it, let's say, it sounds funny to say to move out of that VP. Which mouse did Ollie chase the ball before he attacked? Again, sounds pretty weird. Manner verbs, which is something we'll come to at the end of the lecture, are also kind of an interesting case. Verbs that basically describe how you say something and not that you said something often sound like islands. I should also mention that factive verbs, so verbs that kind of presuppose the truth of their complement, also sound kind of funny to move out of. So if you say something like, which mouse did you whisper that Ollie attacked? That most of the time sounds a little bizarre. This one's a little bit more malleable, and that's kind of an interesting thing to comment on. But that is a little unusual. You can also It also sounds unusual, again, as I said, to use a verb that's factive. So if you say something like, "Which mouse did you know that Ollie attacked?" Again, that sounds a little weird. Comparatives are also a little funny to move out of. These are almost hard to even begin to formulate, but which mouse did Sniffle see the cat bigger than? Right? So the cat that's bigger than, some mouse. It sounds kind of funny to query who that mouse is. And finally, this is actually my favorite. I've had people tell me that this doesn't quote unquote count as an island, and I don't really know what that means, to be honest. But generally speaking, moving or having a filler gap dependency with a subject sounds funny if that subject happens to sit right next to a complementizer. This is a little weird, and we will come back to this, but it sounds okay to say, which cat did Sniffle say attacks mice? But it sounds worse to say, which cat did Sniffle say that attacks mice? This one is a little weird. This one is a little bit more subtle, but this is a pretty reliable finding that people have a dispreference for using the complementizer here in a way that we don't see if you have object movement. So if you say something like, which mouse did Sniffle say that Ollie attacked? That sounds okay. And which mouse did Sniffle say Ollie attacked? Also sounds fine. This is an important thing to mention because we'll mention this again when we talk about the psycholinguistics of filler gap dependencies and specifically island phenomena. But some islands have a loophole. Some islands allow you to repair the structure somehow. Why this is, what this means, what the significance of this is something to ask your syntactician friends. But as we observed, if you have a conjunction, it sounds a little funny to move out of one of the conjoined phrases. Which mouse did Ollie chase the ball and attack? Sounds pretty weird. But if you are associating that filler with all of the things that have been conjoined, so in this case with all of the verbs in the verb phrases that have been conjoined, it sounds better. So which mouse did Ollie chase and attack sounds okay. So we understand this sentence as being a question about one mouse that Ollie chased and attacked, right? So there's one mouse that we're talking about and Ollie did two actions to it, and we're querying which mouse had both of those actions done to it. So it's called ATB. This stands for across the board movement. That's an analysis that I think is probably deprecated or maybe not really popular. It doesn't matter for our purposes. I just want you to notice that normally moving out of, or having a filler gap dependency, let's say, into one phrase that's been conjoined with another phrase sounds weird, but having a filler associated with a gap in multiple phrases sounds okay. That will become relevant when we talk about this from a psycholinguistic perspective. Similarly, I mentioned that clausal adjuncts and subjects also are islands, right? So it sounds funny to say, which mouse did Ollie chase the ball before he attacked? And which cat did the plan to feed satisfy his brother? This is a different sentence than what I showed you before. But both of these sound weird, right? So again, because I have a gap inside of a clausal adjunct, or in the second case, because I have a gap inside of a subject, both of those sound funny. But just like with the ATB movement cases, we see that we can fix these by putting another gap outside of the relevant island. So it sounds okay to say, which mouse did Ollie chase before he attacked, right? So again, there's one mouse that Ollie chased, and he chased it before he attacked the same mouse, and that sounds okay. So the same structure can be grammatical if there's another gap kind of outside of that structure. Similarly, which cat did the plan to feed satisfy is also okay, right? So that, again, cat is understood as the object of the verb feed and satisfy. And as long as that double H phrase, which cat, is associated with both gaps, then the sentence sounds okay. Okay, so that's the basic inventory. What all of those structures have in common is something we need to explain, right? So one of the things that we want to account for if we're trying to give a good theory of island phenomena is what precisely all of these structures have in common such that they are islands, right? That's one of the things that is on the menu. If you go take a syntax class, you will learn various theories that try to capture some of these properties together, and that's one of the things that we want to try to explain. Similarly, we also have to explain why some islands are not always islands, right? We have to explain why sometimes clausal adjuncts are islands and sometimes they aren't, depending on whether there's another gap in that same structure. That's a pretty hard task, I'm going to be honest with you. I will tell you, this is me editorializing right now. We've made quite a lot of progress on understanding island phenomena, I think. We've learned a lot of kind of what makes them tick. We've learned a lot of what are some kind of surprising exceptions or some surprising examples of islands. I don't know that generative syntacticians have a good theory that captures all of the facts that I just showed you. If you ask one of my colleagues whether they agree with me, they might disagree. They might say that everything looks great. But I will say that this is a hard problem, right? And I think we'll kind of get a taste for that in a minute here. The second thing we need to explain is, well, which kinds of phenomena care about islands? All the examples I used so far use WH questions, but that's not necessary. So island phenomena are not just about WH questions. That's an important thing to keep in mind for something I'll mention at the end of this lecture. This is not a theory of WH questions. It's a property of different kinds of relations that we see in grammatical structures. And there's lots of things that seem to be sensitive to islands. So we already saw WH questions. So here's an example of a WH question over a weather island. By the way, I should mention, I had a friend of mine who's a psychologist. I won't name her because I don't want to sound like I'm shaming her. But one time she overheard me and another linguist talking about islands. And she asked me, Weather Island, where is Weather Island? Right. So now I can't, every time I say Weather Island, I hear it as meaning some island that has, notable weather, like some sunny beach or something. It's Weather Island, right, with a WH, not WEATHER. But anyway, so that's a digression. So here, which mouse did you say whether Ollie attacked, right? Which mouse is understood as the object of the verb attacked, and it sounds weird because we have that word weather, right, in the middle. We also see the same kind of phenomena happen with relative clauses. So this is the mouse that you said whether Ollie attacked, right? So here I marked in blue the mouse as the thing that's quote unquote moved. Again, different theories will say different things here. But again, just observationally, we understand that the mouse is the object of the verb attacked here. And it sounds funny to have that relation over the word whether. So notice this is not a WH question, right? But it's something very different. And we can get into like more exotic kinds of phenomena. So with clausal comparatives, we also see island phenomena. So Sniffle is a bigger cat than you said whether Ollie is. So here again, we understand that what we're saying is Ollie is a big cat and Sniffle is a big cat, and the degree to which Sniffle is a big cat is greater than the degree to which Ollie is a big cat. But we can't have the sentence have that meaning if bigger cat and that gap after the word is crosses the word whether. We also see tough movement, which is again also a very kind of exotic phenomena that we have in English. Sniffle is tough to know whether Ollie attacked, right? So another way to paraphrase this is, it is tough to know whether Ollie attacked Sniffle. This is a true sentence. My cats fight each other all the time, and then they play and they snuggle, and there's no evidence that they got into a fight, and I don't know who attacked who. This is a true sentence, right? So again, what we see here is that if tough, I should be marking Sniffle here in blue. So if we understand Sniffle as the object of the verb attacked, that can't happen over the word whether. And finally, we also see kind of an exotic construction, the adjective though construction. Cute though you know whether Ollie is, he attacks Sniffle a lot. Right, so here, cute is understood as kind of the predicate that we are providing to the subject Ollie, But if we can't do that, again, we can't do that over the word weather. A good exercise for you to do on your own time is to take these sentences and make them sound grammatical by swapping out the word weather for the word that, and all of these should sound good, right? So again, we see that there's some kind of dependency that cannot cross the word weather. And it's worth mentioning that this is not, so one of the things you might be noticing here is that every time we have an island sensitivity is what we might call it. Every time we have island sensitivity, there's a gap, right? There's a part of the sentence that's missing. Like we have a verb that's missing an object, or we have a be verb that's missing a predicate. Yeah. So cute though you know Ollie, whether Ollie is, we're missing that the adjective that comes after the verb to be here, right? We're after the verb is. So in all of these cases, we have a gap. So here's a hypothesis we might propose. Hypothesis 1, island phenomena affect any kind of long distance grammatical dependency. Hypothesis 2, island phenomena apply to any filler, any dependency that has a gap, right? Whereas one of the parts is missing. Both of those hypotheses seem to be false. So here's two data points that demonstrate this, right? So did the mouse say whether Ollie attacked it? So here we have a dependency where it refers back to the mouse, and that's totally fine, right? It's completely fine to have a antecedent pronoun dependency cross the word whether. So I marked the word whether in green here to demonstrate that that is a porous, that the whether is porous to that kind of dependency. And we see that there are dependencies that involve a missing part, a gap, that are also not island sensitive. Sniffle is a big cat, but I forgot whether Ollie is too, right? That sounds fine. So again, we're claiming that Sniffle is a big cat, and then we're also saying that I forgot whether Ollie is a big cat. So this is an ellipsis construction. And we see that ellipsis doesn't care about this either. So if we're trying to explain this, this is a pretty tough thing to explain, right? We have to explain why certain dependencies care about islands, which as we saw before is a big long list of different kinds of constructions, but other dependencies don't, even other dependencies that look pretty similar, right? So if you are a generativist, you might suspect that although these constructions are all kind of bizarre, right? Although this is a very kind of bizarre set of facts about language, this is somehow diagnostic or dispositive of how grammar works, and we might hope that children have some guess about how grammar works already, which will steer them to discover these facts in some sense, right? Again, we will talk about the language acquisition question after we feel a little bit more comfortable thinking and talking about islands. So I want to give one theory of how islands might work. Again, as I said, this is not a complete theory. It does not explain everything, but it's a good theory, and I think most modern syntacticians have a variant of this in mind when we talk about islands. As all things in language, the devil is in the details, right? As you dig deeper past the surface, you see that the theory gets a lot more complicated, as always. But this basic intuition is something that's shared in most modern approaches to how islands phenomena work. So this is, I think I have the wrong citation here, actually. This is from a paper by Chomsky called On Double H Movement, which was written in the 70s. I think it was not 1971. I think it was actually 1977. I have a different citation in mind here. And the basic claim is something like the following, right? So again, within kind of mainstream Chomskyan generative syntax, we think about the relation between long-distance dependencies as involving movement, right? There's one representation where you have a phrase in one position where it serves one function, and then it moves, right? It changes location into another part of that structure where it serves a secondary function. And one of the ideas that Chomsky had is that there's something called successive cyclic movement. Some of you may have heard of this term before, some of you maybe haven't. But the basic idea is every time you move a phrase through, when you have a big sentence like this, right? Which mouse did you say that Ollie attacked? You have to stop at each of the edges of a clause, right? In the biz, we call this spec CP. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. You can just think of that as being like the most left edge of the sentence, right? So which mouse did you say that Ollie attacked? The basic idea is that the sentence starts something like, did you say that Ollie attacked which mouse? And then we have to move, we want which mouse to get to the beginning of the sentence. So in order to get it there, we have to first stop by that intermediate position. So we get something like, did you say which mouse that Ollie attacked? And then we have to move it again to get to that very beginning of the sentence. Which mouse did you say that Ollie attacked? So the idea here is that the furthest distance you can move is to the edge of a clause. And once you're in the edge of a clause, you can only move to the other edge of the clause, right? So you start off wherever you start off, you move to the edge of a clause, and if you're in the right position, you're done. And if you're not, then you move to the next edge of the clause, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's like the basic assumption, right? That answers the question, how does grammar work, right? And that's Chomsky's proposal, movement is successive cyclic. If you learn other theories of syntax, like lexical functional grammar or head-driven phrase structure grammar, as we talked about before, there's different ways of approaching this. I will tell you, they often share the same intuition, which is that movement that looks really far isn't really far. It's actually kind of stepwise in a sense, let's say. Okay, so let's look at a particular kind of island, which is the WH island, right? Again, not a location, right? Which mouse did you say who attacked? So here's the basic idea, right? If you want to try to derive this sentence, you have which mouse starting in the object of the verb attacked, and you need to get it to that very far left edge. And so there's two ways to do that. One way is to move it to that intermediate position, but that place is already occupied. It's occupied by the word who. And English doesn't allow you to do that, right? We can't, if you want to use a sentence with multiple WH questions, you put both at the beginning, right? You say who bought what, you don't say who what bought, let's say, right? So it seems that in English, we only like to have one thing at the left edge of a sentence, and so this is a violation of some principle of how English works. Oops, I went backwards. And similarly, the idea is, the alternative is I could jump ahead, right? I could jump right over that intermediate position and go into that very left edge. But as I said, the claim is that that's too far. So the idea is that because movement has to be successive cyclic, this violates that principle. So there's two ways we might try to derive this sentence, but both of them does something wrong. In the first case, we violate a property of English, which is we don't like to put two things at the left edge of a clause. And in order to derive this sentence, we would have to stop by that intermediate position, right? So obeying successive cyclicity violates some principle of the phrase structure of English, right? To use like X bar theory, we only have one specifier in CP, and that position's already filled, so that's a problem. The other one is what's sometimes called a subjacency violation. I only say this because you might see this word subjacency. This has a technical definition, but again, the idea is that subjacency basically what's meant by this, when we say something is a subjacency violation, is we move too far, right? You're only supposed to go from clause edge to clause edge, and we skip to clause edge. That's one way to think about this. Okay. So this is a good explanation, I think, right? Both of these are motivated. The subjacency idea, the successive cyclicity idea, that's the claim about kind of how grammar works. Like that is the meta theory of how language works. And then that phrase structure violation component, that's a specific property of English, but that's something we have to learn. You have to learn that in English, if you have a multiple WH question, you put one WH word at the beginning and not all of them. We're going to come back to this because not all languages exactly work that way. And the idea is that because you have these two properties, the subjacency idea or the successive cyclicity idea might be innate, right? If you kind of follow Chomsky's logic here, that phrase structure property is not necessarily innate, but it is something that has to be learned. And as a consequence, you deduce that the sentence, which mouse did you say who attacked, is bad, right? In other words, you don't actually have to learn that WH phrases are islands. You learn other things about your language, and as a consequence, you stumble upon the conclusion that this sentence isn't good. That's a good theory of how learning could work from this perspective. Okay, so we explained one kind of island phenomena. The task that syntacticians then have to have to do, right, what we have to do as syntacticians is go through and determine whether this works for all of these structures. And I will tell you, some of these we have a better theory of than others, I'm sorry to say. Some of these we have a better account. The kind of explanation I just provided to you works better for some of these than others. For some of these, we have to make some stipulations that might be right or they might not be right, right? We might be missing something in the analysis. That's okay. That's the goal of trying to understand these things. The other thing that we then need to do is we need to say something is shared and common with these first 5 constructions, these first 5 kinds of dependencies that is not observed in the latter 2, right? So there's something that pronoun dependencies have and ellipsis dependencies have that WH and relative clauses and comparatives and tough movement and adjective though type constructions don't. For Chomsky, right, and again, as kind of just a basic assumption of theoretical generative syntax, WH dependencies, relative clauses, comparatives, tough movement, and adjective though constructions all involve movement of something, right? You move the WH phrase, maybe you move the adjective in the adjective though type constructions, maybe you move the subject in tough movement type cases, maybe you move something else actually, right? This is, again, one of the things that we have to try to give an account for. The other thing we have to explain is how does the child know that tough movement, right, has movement, right? How is the child supposed to figure out that, say, comparative, Sniffle is a bigger cat than you said whether Ollie is the kind of dependency that needs to obey the island constraints, but ellipsis isn't, right? That's something that we also have to explain. That's not easy. As we've said before, explaining how children learn the grammatical facts of their language is not easy, but saying that children might have some of this knowledge innately already ahead of time might be helpful. Might be helpful. If you're a generativist, you hope it's helpful, but maybe not. So I want to present some more data. So this has all been about English, right? At this point, you might be asking yourself, are we overfitting our theory to one particular kind of language or one particular kind of phenomena? Again, these are all kind of weird facts about English that I presented, right? If I were designing English from scratch, I probably would not have come up with island constraints or island phenomena. And so we might wonder, do other languages show the same kind of data? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So what is an island in language A is almost always an island in language B. What kind of structure is sensitive to islands in language A is almost always sensitive to islands in language B. Now, that said, there are differences, and this is important, right? Again, if we're trying to explain how children learn language, those differences are important. If we observe that one language can work one way and another language can work a different way, that means the child can't know ahead of time what the answer is, right? The child has to figure out, am I learning a language that looks like English, or am I learning a language that looks like something else? And I want to tell you that one of the nice things about the kind of analysis that I just sketched to you, this adjacency, successive cyclicity analysis, is it gives you some tools for trying to understand how languages might be similar and how languages might be different. Again, every time we find a difference, though, we also find a problem that needs to be solved from the perspective of the child learner. That's fine. We will talk about the child learner next week. But I just want to demonstrate to you some of what we're talking about, right? So the first thing that some of you might be thinking about is, well, not all languages move WH questions, right? So famously, languages like Mandarin Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese, language like many languages of Asia, but even sometimes French, like you can leave WH questions in their quote-unquote base position. Lots of languages don't require or even don't allow you to move a WH question. And so what's interesting is we observe that in a language like Mandarin Chinese has islands, but it doesn't have all of the same islands as English. And this is very funny, right? So here, the first sentence is a sentence of Mandarin Chinese that's grammatical in Mandarin Chinese, but is ungrammatical in English. So 你想知道李斯为什么买了什么 is something like, what do you wonder why Lisa bought, right? So In this sentence, we're asking about why Li Si bought something. In English, you have to, if you're trying to pronounce that sentence, you have to put the word what at the beginning. In Mandarin Chinese, you don't move the word shema. I'm sorry, I marked Li Si in blue. Wei shema, the word for why, is the thing that's important here, right? So here we have two double H phrases, and in English, we would have to move one of them over the other, which would incur a double H island violation. But in Mandarin Chinese, you leave both double H phrases in C2, you leave them both where they belong, and the sentence is fine. So that means in Mandarin Chinese, you can ask questions that you can't ask in English, right? So whatever the explanation of why the English sentence, what do you wonder why Li Si bought, sounds bad, can't be that no one would ever want to say that sentence. Because in Chinese, you can. So either there's no reason to say the sentence, in which case we've explained why the English sentence is bad, but then we have to explain why the Chinese sentence is good, right? Or something else, right? So the fact that a structure is an island in one language but not the other means that we really need to look at some property of the structure of that sentence to make sense of it. That said, not all sentences, not all double H phrases, or sorry, not all structures that are islands in English are porous in Mandarin Chinese. So there are some things that are islands in both languages. This one's a little bit harder to see, to explain, but if we take the English sentence, why do you like the person that bought the book? That string of words is fine, but it has to mean, why do you like that person, right? This cannot mean something like, you like the person that bought the book for some reason. What was that reason? Why did you like the person that bought the book? Oh, I like that person that bought the book because he saw it on New York Times bestseller list, right? That can't be a question about the reason why the book was bought. The same thing is true in Mandarin Chinese. So you say something like, you most like why book bought that person, right? So Mandarin Chinese relative clauses come before the noun. So wei shema mai shu de run. So that thing that's in square brackets, that's the relative clause, and it precedes the noun per person. And if you have that double H phrase why inside of that relative clause, that's not grammatical. So that's interesting because you might suspect that part of the reason why English speakers don't like that sentence, why do you like the person that bought the book, is because we want it to be a question about liking the person. But this Mandarin Chinese example does not have that possibility of ambiguity. The word why is in the relative clause. It has to be a question. If it were grammatical, it would have to be a question about why that person bought the book. But it just can't mean that. It's just not grammatical for this string to have that interpretation. So this is interesting. And again, I will not give you a good explanation here, but it turns out that many things that are islands in English are also islands in Mandarin Chinese, but not everything. And this kind of forces us to give some explanation for these facts, right? Part of the explanation is that maybe things in Mandarin Chinese are moving, even though they don't look like they're moving. But then, when we look at cases like the first sentence, the equivalent to, what do you wonder why Li Si bought, we have to say something like, either that word shamma, what, isn't actually moving, and therefore there's no island violation incurred, or something else is happening, right? We have to give some other kind of explanation for those facts. This is still an ongoing area of research. Semanticists have kind of also got involved in this conversation, and they've argued that some islands might tell you something about semantic composition. I won't go further into that, but there's a lot of very interesting research on this, and some of that is actually occurring here at UCSC. So, for instance, my colleague Jess Law has done some interesting work on this kind of data. Another thing that I think is interesting and is kind of a unexpected consequence of the successive cyclicity idea is that we know that there are languages where you pronounce WH questions multiple times and you pronounce them at the left edge of a clause. So not all dialects of German do this, but some dialects of German do exactly this. This is sometimes called partial WH movement in one case, or WH copying. So here I have two sentences in English, two sentences in German, and the first one in English is something like, who do the visitors think they have seen? And what I've given here, what I've done for you is I've marked in gray in the English sentence where that double H phrase has moved through, right? So again, according to the successive cyclicity idea, you have to stop by the left edge of every clause. So who do the visitors think who they have seen who, something like that. And it turns out in some dialects of German, Kashmiri does something similar, by the way, which is a language that I'm know more about than German. You can say things like, well, I won't try to pronounce this in German because I don't know German, but who think the visitors who they seen have. So in other words, where the theory of grammar says we have a version of the double H word who, German actually pronounces a word in that position. And something else kind of interesting happens, which is that sometimes, this is sometimes called partial double H movement. It's claimed that languages like Hindi Urdu also do something like this. There's disagreement about that, but you can say things in German like, what think the visitors with who they have spoken? And if you say that, it's understood as a question about with who. So it kind of looks, so one way to think about this, right, is the structure of the sentence is something like, with whom starts at the very bottom of that syntax tree. It moves into that intermediate position, and that's kind of where it surfaces. But then you move like just the double H part, or maybe you just insert the word what at the very top just to mark the double H scope, right? And you understand the chain. You understand all three parts as being the same thing. So I understand that word was at the top tells you that this whole thing is a question. Mit wem in the middle tells you kind of what the double H phrase is. It's a query about who you did something with, right? And then the gap tells you kind of where that position has come from. So this is why I'm talking about this, right? This is something that you might expect if you have this idea of successive cyclicity and you have a particular theory of how things move around in a sentence. And so again, this is good, right? If we think that we have a description of how syntax works, and syntax says, for instance, that when you move something, you make a copy, and then you pronounce your copies differently, then we predict that languages like this might exist, and they sure do. And we'll also see that children also might produce sentences like this occasionally, even when they're learning a language like English that doesn't actually look like this in the adult grammar. Another thing, this is actually one of my favorite facts. As I told you, part of the explanation for certain islands in English is that we need to move over a spec CP, right? And that spec CP sometimes is just full. In other words, successive cyclicity says movement has to go through every clause edge, but sometimes stuff is already occupying that position, and the grammar of English just doesn't look like it allows you to fill that slot with multiple things. Not all languages work that way. I already alluded to this. So some Slavic, but not all Slavic languages seem to have a different grammar. They don't look like English in this respect. So as I said, in English, if we have two double H questions in the same sentence, we don't put both at the beginning, right? We can say things like who sees who or who bought what, but we don't say who what but who what bought or who sees, right? But you do in Bulgarian. So in Bulgarian, if you have double H questions, you move all of the double H questions to the place where they belong. I don't speak Bulgarian, so I won't try to pronounce this, but in Bulgarian you say something like who whom sees. Yeah? You don't say who sees whom, you put both double H questions at the beginning. And this can happen across long distance, right? So you can say things like where you think that has gone. And this means something like, who do you think has gone where? So again, we see in English, you move the word who all the way to the beginning, but then you leave the word where downstairs. In Bulgarian, you don't. Both double H questions move to the very beginning. Now, what's interesting, right? So in other words, again, that looks like in Bulgarian, you can have multiple things in a spec CP position or in a left clause edge position. And as a consequence, the theory now predicts that Bulgarians should not have WH islands. And that's true. So it's reported that you can say things in Bulgarian like, I saw a book that I wonder who knows who sells. So that sounds very funny to even pronounce in English, right? So again, I wonder who knows who sells some book, and oh, I know a book that I wonder who knows who sells. That sounds really weird in English, but it's fine in Bulgarian, right? And it's predicted to be fine because those double H phrases, those words, koi, I think is how you say that, right? Those who's that I marked in blue here in Bulgarian, but marked red in English, they are in the left edge of the clause, but again, Bulgarian has no problem putting two things in the left edge of the clause. So as the word that means, the expression that means a book that, right, Edna Kniga Koyato or whatever, as that moves from the bottom of the syntax tree all the way to the top, it doesn't get, there's no problem with it stopping by and sharing space with those words who, koi, in the middle, right? Just to kind of say that a little bit more clearly, right? So in other words, there's nothing wrong with this kind of structure where, again, here I'm just representing that the kind of relative clause marker, koyato, is the thing that's moving. If that moves from that very bottom of the tree and it stops at all of those intermediate position, nothing goes awry because Bulgarian allows you to have multiple things at the left edge of a clause, and none of these violate subjacency. None of these moves are too far, so there's nothing wrong with this. Now, again, this is something a child has to figure out, right? And God help you if the way that the child is supposed to figure this out is to wait for mom to say, I know a book that I wonder who knows who sells, right? People probably don't say that very often, but they probably do say things like who went where in English or who where went, right? So we want a theory that, here's a proposal, right? Maybe what happens is children hear their Bulgarian speaking adult in their life say who where went. And then they say, ah, okay, I can have two things in the left edge of a clause. And now that I know that, I now know it comes for free. It's a deduction, it's an inference that this big complicated sentence in Bulgarian is good, but the child who is listening to their English speaking adults in their life will hear mom and dad or aunts and uncles or parents or whoever say things like who went where, and they'll say, ah, okay, English doesn't like to have two things at the left edge of a clause, therefore I know a book that I wonder who knows who sells should not be generable, right? My grammatical system has no way of producing that kind of sentence. I want to mention another kind of case that where the argument is something similar, and this is that trace phenomena, which again I've mentioned is one of my favorite phenomena, right? So as we said before, it sounds funny to say something like, which cat did Sniffle say that attacks mice? It sounds okay to leave the word that out. Which cat did Sniffle say attacks mice? This is not observed in lots of languages. In Spanish, for instance, you can say that. You can put the word that in an embedded clause, and you can also have a subject question. So you can say something like, ¿Quién dijiste que vio a María? So who you said that saw, and I'm marking this a as accusative. This is how you know that María is the object, and that sentence is totally fine, right? So again, this is something that the child has to figure out. One possibility is that the child who's learning Spanish has to wait for their mom or uncle or their bigger brother or bigger sister or whoever to say a sentence like this. And if they're lucky enough to notice it, they now have a data point that tells them that this kind of structure is grammatical. Alternatively, right, maybe there's something else about Spanish that allows them to have this sentence be possible. There's a parse that's available. There's a way of drawing a syntax tree for this string of words that doesn't violate any principle of universal grammar, right? So that's hypothesis 2. Spanish actually does have that trace constraint, whatever that is, whatever kind of violation that might be, but they have a workaround, right? They have an alternative route to producing a sentence like this. And that has been proposed. So it's been observed that in Spanish, we can put the subject either before or after the subject. So in Spanish, you can say something like Juan vio a María, so John saw Maria or Mary, or you can say vio Juana María. You can say saw John Maria or Mary. I guess I've glossed Maria as Mary here. So the point here is the subject is movable, right? Sometimes the subject can be before the verb and sometimes it can be after the verb. And so we might suggest that whatever that trace thing is, says that I don't like it when the complementizer that is next to a gap, right? Or a trace or whatever you want to call it. That's why it's called the that trace. We talked last week about this idea of trace as kind of an idea that syntacticians had used at one point in time. So the that trace is the thing that happens when you have the word that next to a trace, right? So if you have that kind of combination of things, the sentence sounds weird for whatever reason, right? We don't have very good theories of that trace, or at least we didn't when I thought about this stuff more carefully than I do now. But that does seem to be a pretty robust fact. Now, there's some reason to suspect that the constraint is, this is a good description of the constraint, because even in English we can make that trace violation sound better if we phonologically play around with it a little bit, right? So for instance, if we put in a positive between the word that and the trace, it sounds okay. Which cat did Sniffle say that apparently attacks mice? That sounds okay compared to which cat did Sniffle say that attacks mice apparently? That sounds kind of weird, right? Again, because you have that combination of the word that and the trace next to each other. And I've just showed you in Spanish, we have ways of moving that subject around. And because we can move subjects around, that means we can move subjects either from that position. You know, the subject could have started before the verb, or it could have started after the verb. And in the first case, the idea is that that violates the that trace constraint just as much as the English equivalent does. But if we put the gap after the verb, right, if that's a possible parse of the sentence, the prediction is that this should be good. So this is the explanation, right? One of the explanations that people have proposed is that if you have a language like Spanish where subjects are allowed to kind of move around, then it's always possible to move the subject from a position that would not yield that trace violation, right? That's a parse, that's a representation that's possible that you can assign to that string of words that's compatible with the universal law that says don't put the word that and trace together, and with the language-specific details about where subjects might or might not go. This makes a prediction that there shouldn't be a language where you can put subjects wherever you want, but also the sentence that I'm talking about here, where you extract the subject and also have a complementizer, sounds bad, right? Because I just told you that if you have mobility in where you place the subject, then you should always have the capacity to assign a representation to that sentence that doesn't violate that trace constraint. Therefore, the prediction is languages where subjects are mobile should not give you that trace violations on the surface. Now, we've investigated this a little bit. This is actually one of the things that my dissertation was on, so this is why it's one of my favorite phenomena. And that prediction seems to be right. We don't have a lot of data, unfortunately, but at least when I looked at this 10 years ago, so maybe it's gotten more complicated. Again, in linguistics, you dig deeper and things get really, really complicated really, really fast. But we observe that this was a study by Gilligan where he went through a whole bunch of descriptions of different languages and he tried to find what seems to matter for predicting whether you have that trace violations or not. And what he finds is there are no languages where subjects can be movable, let's say. They can go after the verb. And you cannot say the equivalent of, who did you say that attacked Ollie? Right? So that prediction might be right. Now, that's good if that's the kind of theory we want. But that's worth testing that prediction, right? And that our theory makes a prediction is important because that's how you tell whether theories are good or not, right? So I'm almost about at an hour, so I just want to kind of explain to you what I've just told you, right? So what is in the theory, right? What I've told you is that there are islands, right, that fall out, right? These phenomena are meant to be explained by appeals to some basic facts about how movement works, about like things like the that trace effect or the that trace violation, that trace constraint, whatever that is. I haven't actually told you what the constraint is or why language should have it. But the idea is that there's a couple of ingredients that tell you this is how language works, right? And maybe those are the kinds of things that children are born knowing. Like children are born knowing if things move around, they have to move clause edge to clause edge. And ideally, we would hope to explain that from deeper principles. If you read kind of more recent modern Chomsky stuff, he tries to derive this. I won't go into that. And then children learn details of specific properties of the phrase structure of their language. English, we put one thing at the left edge of a clause, max. In Bulgarian, you can put lots of stuff at the left edge, right? And when you put those pieces together, you can't help but come to the deduction that certain structures are islands in languages A, B, and C, and certain structures are maybe not islands in languages D, E, and F, right? Like that's the kind of explanation we want. So what this kind of theory explains is these predictable differences between languages, right? That co-vary with other features. If Bulgarian lets you put lots of stuff at the left edge, then you predict that you shouldn't have double H islands. If Spanish lets you put subjects after verbs, then you predict you should be able to avoid violating that trace constraint. What it doesn't predict, what we haven't said much about, is whether all islands are similar or not. And the answer to that seems to be no. So some islands do seem to be worse than others. And this theory does not try to say anything about that. And we haven't really said much about processing, right? We've spent a lot of time thinking about, hypothetically, how children might come to learn specific details of specific island phenomena in their specific languages. So we've tried to answer the language acquisition question. We haven't really said anything about parsing or psycholinguistics, and that's fine, right? I mean, that's not what the theory is meant to capture, but we haven't really said anything about that. And why am I making this point? I want to just, in my last couple slides, just give you two alternatives. So there are two alternatives. I will tell you, one of these alternatives is still considered live, right? People are debating this. In fact, some of this research is happening here at UCSC with my colleagues Ivy Seashell and Matt Wagers. They've been doing some really interesting work on this topic with some of their students. One of these theories, I think, is no longer really live. I think this one of the alternatives that I'm going to present to you is largely discredited, but I think understanding like what the claim is important here. So I'm going to start with the mostly discredited. As I told you before, I feel like in science, very few debates are actually ever completely resolved. Usually what happens is people get bored and they start doing other things. And sometimes, you convince 60% of the field something is true and 40% don't believe you, and that's considered a victory. Sometimes you convince 80% of the field and 20%. It's rarely 100%, right? But nonetheless, I say that as a caveat because someone might come up to me and say, no, I think this is right. But I will say that largely I think people have moved on from exploring this hypothesis. And this hypothesis says islands are islands because they're too hard to process. The meaning or the structure that we're saying is ungrammatical isn't ungrammatical. It's just too hard to process, so it's something that people struggle to consider, and for that reason it sounds funny, right? We've already talked about processing of filler gap dependencies before, and one of the things that we said is people really, really want to try to relate a filler with a gap as soon as possible. So we saw when people read a sentence like, my brother wanted to know who Ruth would bring us home to at Christmas, people really want that who to be the object of the verb bring. And then when we see that word us, we realize we made a mistake, and then we have to reanalyze the sentence. We have to kind of start over, right? The claim is that maybe that process, right, of kind of storing that double H word who in memory and then holding that in memory as we process some other stuff is costly, right? That uses some kind of memory resource. You also might notice all of the structures I've talked about are arguably, we will argue about this, but are arguably kind of complicated, right? So the structures we've talked about are complex. So maybe in an expression like the rumor about Greg, that's a complex noun phrase. If you think about the tree structure, it kind of hangs off the left edge of the sentence, and maybe that makes things a little bit complicated. The idea is that processing complicated structures while also trying to process the filler gap dependency is two things that are hard, and you can't do both at the same time, right? You have $5 in the bank and you're trying to buy something that costs $4 and something that costs $3, right? You just can't do both at the same time. Or this is maybe something like, you can't pat your belly and rub your head at the same time. Doing one is fine, but doing both simultaneously exceeds some capacity that we have, right? So our bank account or our motor planning or what have you. We'll explore this a little bit more when we talk about the psycholinguistics of filler gap dependencies and the psycholinguistics of island phenomena. But I will tell you that I think there's enough evidence now that suggests that this can't be quite right. This can't exactly be the right explanation. But we'll talk about it because it's illustrative to kind of think about how we can know, right? The other theory, and this is the theory that I think is still kind of live, that has some kind of data behind it, is that maybe there's something pragmatically unusual about island violations. So these are sometimes called usage-based explanations or functionalist explanations, we might suggest. There are theories called cognitive linguistics that are based on this kind of intuition. And the idea is that the form of language kind of encodes some information about its intended communicative function, let's say. And so the idea is that H constructions are used to request new information, and a lot of islands are specifically marking information that's old or that's quote unquote backgrounded, or that's not really the point of the sentence, right? And so we mentioned manner verbs, right? So if you say something like, you whispered that Ollie attacked the blue mouse, when you say a sentence like that, it's really not about Ollie attacking. It's really about the way you said something, right? Compare that with something like, you said that Ollie attacked the blue mouse. That sentence can be a statement about what Ollie attacked according to you, right? That's one way to think about it. So the claim here is that a verb like whisper tends to background the complement clause more, and it's kind of anomalous to try to request new information about something that in the same sentence you are marking as already established and old, right? It's kind of like trying to do two things that are contradictory, and that's the form of the explanation. Like I said, I think this is still a live hypothesis, and there's some interesting data that kind of suggests something along these lines, at least for this particular case. So I'm going to very briefly present this study by Ambridge and Goldberg. They've done follow-up work, and other people have kind of given variants of this hypothesis. If this is something you're interested in, this is a potentially useful area to explore for your journal submission, right? And one of the things that they did is they noticed, right, that this idea of information being backgrounded means that it's not at issue, right? It means that if the matrix sentence is negated, it means that we're not really negating or addressing even the complement clause. So I said that a little clumsily. If I say something like, she mumbled that he left, it doesn't really tell you one way or the other whether he left or not. And if I say she didn't mumble that he left, it also doesn't really tell you whether he left or not, right? Because the point of saying she didn't mumble that he left or she mumbled that he left isn't whether he left. The point is the mumbling. It's the way that she said something, right? Contrast that with verbs like know or think. Know, as I said before, is a factive verb. Know requires that the complement is true, right? So if someone is using the verb know, they're usually using it to say something about that person's knowledge state, and the person who's saying it is just assuming everyone's on the same page that that complement clause is true. So if I said she knew that he left, that pretty much implies that he left. If I say she didn't know that he left, I'm saying she didn't know something, but I'm still kind of presuming that everybody agrees that he left, right? So if you say she didn't know that he left, that presupposes that he left. Finally, if I say something like she didn't think that he left, then it seems to, now that he left seems to be more at issue, right? The point of the sentence is about him leaving, or at least it can be understood that way. So if I say something like she didn't think that he left, this could be used to make the claim that he didn't leave, right? So you ask me, oh, did he leave? And I say, oh, she didn't think he left, right? That's one way of communicating to you, I think he didn't, he didn't leave according to her, right? So there, the negation of that main clause think is really telling you also information about the complement clause. So why am I talking about this, right? I'm talking about this because verbs like mumble that don't tell you anything about whether their complement clause is true or not, and verbs like know that presuppose that the complement clause is true, are both instances of verbs that quote unquote background their complement clause, right? In other words, both of these kinds of verbs tell you that that complement clause isn't the thing that we're talking about. Yeah. And so one way you can kind of quantify this is you can ask people, if you hear the sentence, she didn't think that he left, does that guarantee that he didn't leave? And if you have a verb like think, in which the complement clause is still at issue, it's still part of the main point of the sentence, people should say yes. But for verbs like mumble and know, people should say, no, this isn't about him leaving. I don't know whether he left or not in the case of mumble. Or, yeah, he obviously left, but that's not what we're talking about in the case of no. Okay? And so Ambridge and Goldberg, they were interested in kind of testing this idea. So they used an experiment that basically did exactly what I said. So they asked people to judge sentences like, what did Maria mumble that Ian liked, which sounds weird? What did Maria know that Ian liked, which sounds weird? And what did Maria say that Ian liked, which sounds okay? And then they also asked people to judge whether they think that the sentence Maria didn't mumble that Ian liked the cake, or Maria didn't know that Ian liked the cake, or Maria didn't say that Ian liked the cake, implied that Ian didn't like the cake. I forgot the verb there. Ian didn't the cake. Ian didn't like the cake, right? And the finding is that these things are correlated. So the more you think that that main clause negation implies the negation of the complement clause, which means that that negation kind of smears into that complement clause because the negation is negating the main point of the sentence and the complement clause is part of the main point, right? The more that you have that intuition that the main clause negation applies to the embedded clause, the more that you like WH movement, right? So there's so I should say there's an inverse correlation. The more islandy something is, the more you think the negation doesn't smear into that island. So they argue that this is a good explanation for this fact. I will tell you, I'm going to give you my own personal opinion here. I think Ambridge and Goldberg might be right about this case. What I'm not convinced of is that this scales up to all of the facts that we talked about. I do know that they've done work like this to kind of expand the project and to kind of test more systematically other kinds of dependencies and other kinds of constructions. And the other thing I'm a little concerned about with this work is that I worry that this explains why WH questions are island sensitive, but it doesn't explain all the other stuff, right? We saw that not only WH questions are island sensitive, other kinds of dependencies are. Now, that said, I've also said that I think the kind of typical subjacency based theory also doesn't do a very good job of explaining all the islands. And I will tell you that these kind of manner verb type structures, these are very tough to explain with subjacency. And Ambridge and Goldberg make this point, and to their credit, that in order to get subjacency to work, or the successive cyclicity theory that I outlined at the beginning of my lecture, in order to get this to work, you kind of have to add some stuff in. Like, you have to say every time you use the word no, you have like a secret noun phrase in there. You have to do something to kind of play around with the structure a little bit, right? So it's not resolved, right? And again, my opinion is that I feel like they're probably right about some cases, and I think this is a good example of one case where they might be right. But I want to mention something that's interesting here, right? So what's in this theory, right? What's it? Well, I will say that both the theory that we saw just now, where I went through carefully, where I talked about the pragmatics, let's say, the usage of these structures, and the processing-based theory, which I didn't really describe carefully, but we'll talk about that more soon. Both of these theories are good at trying to explain island phenomena from independently motivated facts about working memory and independently motivated facts about the meanings of these constructions. So that's good, right? That's a good kind of theory. These theories are also good at explaining why certain island violations sound worse or better than others, which the subjacency style theory that I talked about at the beginning doesn't do as good of a job of. And we will see that the the processing based explanation does a pretty good job. It's based off of intuitions, or I should say data. I shouldn't even say intuitions, actual, hard cold data about how processing works. So that's also, a point in the favor that the traditional subjacency based theory doesn't really have. What both of these classes of theories are not as good at explaining is why different languages are different, right? Why are double H phrases islands in English but not in Mandarin Chinese and not in Bulgarian? They don't do such a good job of explaining that. I think they also don't do a very good job of explaining why English has the that trace effect on the surface, but Spanish on the surface doesn't, right? So just to remind you what I'm referencing, right? We are observing that there are facts that appear to be different on the surface between English on one hand and Spanish in one case, Mandarin Chinese in another case, or Bulgarian in the other. And so, if we're advocating for this idea that what ultimately explains island phenomena is that, say, in Bulgaria, that in a sentence like, "What do you wonder why Lisa bought?" that there's a conflict between requesting new information with the word what, but then also presupposing or backgrounding that Lisa bought something by putting the word why at the left edge of that clause. But why would that be a conflict in English but not in Mandarin Chinese? This Mandarin Chinese sentence is grammatical and it means the thing that the English sentence would have meant if the English sentence were grammatical. So there's something that has to be said there, right? There has to be something, if we're really explaining this using functions or the kind of pragmatic use of these expressions, then we have to say something about what's similar and what's different between Mandarin Chinese. And I think that's a really hard game to play. To their credit, Ambridge and Goldberg and other work that Adele Goldberg has done, she's addressed this issue, but I think it's hard to really give a predictive theory, right? It's hard to predict. You could have imagined the opposite conclusion. You could have imagined that Mandarin Chinese doesn't like this sentence that I'm showing you on the screen here, but English does, right? Given that kind of theoretical background. Again, I've also said that to be fair here, the explaining the similarities and differences in double H movement languages like English and double H in C2 languages like Mandarin Chinese is also not easy, right? This is a problem that a lot of people are trying to solve, and it's a hard problem to solve. And as I said before, these kind of processing-based explanations also struggle here, right? So with Mandarin Chinese, maybe there's something to say, but like with the that trace type case or with the Bulgarian type case, we have to say that for some reason, right, if which cat did Sniffle say that attacks mice is bad, it's bad because there's something that's difficult to process about having the complementizer and the subject question at the same time that applies in English but doesn't apply in Spanish. Again, that's a really hard game to play. It's really hard to figure out how to explain that. Yeah. And so again, no one's a winner here, right? Personally, again, I think the kind of the syntax focused type theory has a better hope of getting the facts right. But I think we have to be willing to kind of explore that this is multifactorial, right? Or that maybe sometimes the like what I'll call the pragmatics or the kind of the communicative function might nudge those judgments around a little bit, right? And I think that's I think the processing based explanations are largely not really taken too seriously right now anyway, but these pragmatic type theories are taken seriously, and they are good theories in the sense that they appeal to things that are independently motivated, and they're trying to explain things in a predictive fashion. Okay, so next week I want to return to learning for a little bit. I want to tell you some facts about what we know about how children understand and what they know about double H questions. We'll talk a little bit about how they process them. There's a little bit of work on this. There's not a ton, but we know some things. And we'll explore some possibilities about how children might learn this stuff. As I've said before, right, even if we do take the universal grammar hypothesis seriously, it's not sufficient just to say it's innate, right? Because we still have to say, how do children figure out what the right analysis is for the sentence such that they know that some sentences are good and some sentences are bad, we're going to see one particular model, one particular proposal for how a child could learn this stuff, and we're going to query whether it does away with universal grammar. It won't, right? I mean, the point of that learning model will be to say, here's kind of a middle ground, right? Where you can say some things are innate, but not everything. And here's how children could learn from data some facts about their language. We're also going to explore this idea of processing a little bit. And we're going to return to this question about active filler strategy. And we're going to ask, do people know about islands when they're processing filler gap dependencies? And the answer is going to be surprisingly yes. And that knowledge is actually pretty complex. They do some pretty interesting and clever things when they process filler gap dependencies. And that's going to give us a tool for testing the processing hypothesis. And I'm going to show you from using both psycholinguistic evidence and some data from experimental syntax that these processing-based theories are probably not going to work out. Or at least that's my opinion. Again, I always like to say when I'm giving you my opinion versus when I'm giving you fact. I think it's hard to make sense of the processing-based explanation once you see some particular experimental results and some particular findings that we get from this literature. All right, so until then, now that you know all about islands, we will talk about how children might learn some stuff about islands and how they get processed.